Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bas Kordold, researcher at the Camp Westerbork Memorial Center, and I'm your host tonight for this lecture of the online lecture series that is part of the theme year, The Memory of Camp Westerbork. In this theme year, we investigate the many meanings that have been given to Camp Westerbork in the past 78 years and are still being given. The lecture tonight focuses on the commercialization of the Holocaust through films, museums, and, for example, merchandising. Guest is Tim Cole, historian, professor at the University of Bristol and author of the book Selling the Holocaust, an influential book on this topic that came out at the end of the 21st century. In the next 60 minutes, I will talk with Tim about the commemorization of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, the UK, US, and other countries in the last decades. Of course, you can also ask questions yourself by posting them in the chat of this Zoom meeting. For your information, this lecture will be recorded and later distributed via our social media channels for people who unfortunately cannot attend tonight. Tim, welcome. Selling the Holocaust, first of all, came out already in 1999. Can you remember what the reason, or the main reason was for you to write this book at the time? And how did you approach the research?
Yeah, thanks, Bas. It's really interesting to reflect on a book that's so old now in many ways. You know, it's almost 25 years ago that I wrote this book. I can really remember distinctly the point where I first started to think about writing a book around Holocaust memory and the kind of uses of Holocaust memory or abuses of Holocaust memory. So when I was a graduate student, I was a graduate student researching the Hungarian Jewish experience and the Hungarian Jewish deportations. The PhD I was writing was particularly about Budapest, and I was living in Hungary at the time. This is in the mid-1990s. And so I decided to take a visit to Poland and to go and see Auschwitz, because I wanted to see the place where, you know, most of the Hungarian Jews had been deported in the summer of 1944. So 1994, I decide I'm going to take the train to Krakow, and then I take another train from Krakow to Auschwitz, and then I go to the Auschwitz camp. And the thing that really struck me was I discovered something I wasn't expecting to discover. So I went, you know, with this kind of knowledge base around, in particular, the Hungarian deportations, obviously, but the kind of Jewish history of Auschwitz as a death camp. And I went and I encountered a much more Polish Catholic narrative. You know, this is in the early 90s, so this is just after the changes. So there was a little vestige in some ways of the communist era presentation, but there was the beginning, if you like, of a kind of new Polish Catholic nationalism that was really dominant in that period. And if you remember, those of you who kind of are interested in this was a kind of time of friction in many ways between Catholic and Jewish memory at the site. And so I went to Auschwitz, and it was totally different from what I expected. It told a very different story where it felt that the Jewish dimension of Auschwitz was really kind of pushed down. And this was much more a story of Polish national victimhood. And so that got me interested in thinking, wow, this story is told in very different ways in different places. And I think up until that point, I'd been a more kind of classic historian, if you like. So I hadn't really thought that much about Holocaust memory. I'd thought much more about the Holocaust and its as an event. And so I carried on with the PhD, and I decided what I want to do for the PhD is I want to write one chapter of the PhD, and when it becomes a book about the memory of the Holocaust in Budapest, and in particular about memorialization. I started to get interested in memorialization, but what happened as well was that I started teaching. So I ended up at Bristol University teaching students, and I thought, I want to teach them not just about the history of the Holocaust, but I also want to teach them about the, if you like, the history of the memory of the Holocaust, and in particular, the kind of politics of the memory of the Holocaust. And so I started teaching a class on this. And the more I taught it, the more I thought, actually, I want to write a book about this. So it just became this topic that almost kind of fell upon me, I guess. It was my own visit to Auschwitz got me thinking. I started then working with students and then started reading around this subject. And I thought, actually, I really want to write something about this topic. And to try and take, in the end, what I did was I just took 3 people in 3 places that would represent in some ways Europe, the United States, and Israel. So Adolf Eichmann, Anna Frank, Oskar Schindler, and then Auschwitz the USHMM, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Yad Vashem, which is the equivalent museum in Jerusalem. And I wanted to take those as a kind of way of trying to think about, well, what's happened to the Holocaust in the years since the Holocaust happened? Like, who's talked about it? How have they talked about it? Why have they talked about it? And so it's really one of those projects that was birthed, I guess, just by the fact that I visited a site and was surprised by what I found, and then decided, like, this is too interesting to keep to myself, so I want to teach it to my students. And then it kind of in some ways ended up being a book. And it's weird because it ended up being my first book. So my book on Budapest came out second, came out a little bit later, and so this was the first book I wrote. So it's sort of nice in some ways to have a chance to talk about it. This is maybe therapy, Bas, with you. It's almost to like reflect back on a story from 25 years ago, which I can say more about. Like, maybe we could talk more about that, because I think, in a sense, I think it was very much a book of its time. So I think it was a book that was kind of very much a 1990s book. And I think if we were to look at this now, we'd probably write something quite different. So maybe that's something we can talk more about as we continue our conversation.
It was maybe a book of that time, but was it also a book of somebody in his 20s looking at it?
Yeah,
maybe we're jumping a little bit ahead of other questions, but was it also a book you could only write in that period of your life in comparison to now 25 years later?
Yeah, I think it was a book written by a young man, I think by a young scholar. So it's quite a polemical book. If you've not read it, it's quite polemical. So I think in a sense it was a book that was written by someone in their 20s. So I was in my late 20s when I wrote and published it. And so in some ways I'm an older scholar now who would probably frame things a little bit differently and write a little bit differently. I think what's interesting about it is that it's a book that came out the same year as Peter Novik's book, The Holocaust in American Life. So Peter Novik published a book the same year in 1999. And then Norman Finkelstein published a book called Holocaust Industry in 2000 that I think is far more polemical and is much more about, in a sense, kind of about money making. And I think my book is a little bit more like Peter Novik's book in some ways. Maybe there's a little bit of similarity, but I think it is interesting to reflect back on the fact that at the very same moment in time, in a sense, there were these kind of three books that emerged. And I wonder if those were books that were really about a kind of a moment of almost sounding caution at a particular kind of period in history. So if you just think back to the 90s, one thing I think that's interesting about the 90s is that it was on, I mean, in some ways it feels almost a bit nostalgic now to think back to the 90s, doesn't it? Especially in the context of, like post-Brexit Europe, the war in Ukraine, climate crisis, the challenges that we have with populist nationalism across Europe and further afield. That the 1990s were almost this kind of slightly wistful moment. Fukuyama writes about the end of history, doesn't he? Which is like liberal democracy has won, and the 1990s was about the kind of final victory of liberal democracy. And I think the 1990s were quite an optimistic time in some ways, like a sense that we dealt with the extremes, the political extremes of both fascism and communism within Europe, and that maybe we were kind of building a better future. And I think in some ways, I think the books, all three books, and my book was a little bit of a cautionary note, maybe about almost an over-optimism. And I think in particular, an over-optimism around the idea that if we taught enough kids about the Holocaust, then we'd get rid of racism and anti-Semitism in Europe or globally. And so I think there was a little bit of a sense in some ways right at the end of the 90s that I think I was part of a kind of moment of maybe just critiquing some of that post-1989 over-optimism. So if you think about 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall, that was the real first moment of optimism. And then one of the things that people talk about is they talk about 1993 being the year of the Holocaust. So it's the year when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opens. It's the year when Oscar Schindler's List, Spielberg Schindler's List is really major in the cinema. And it's this moment, if you like, a high point, I guess, of like real Holocaust memory culture and memory work. And I think in some ways the book and maybe the other books around the time were just a little bit of a sense of like saying, actually, are we asking the Holocaust to do too much? Are we asking Holocaust memory to do too much? Are we being overly optimistic that we've dealt with the past within European society and broader society? And so looking back, I think it was very much a book of a moment, which I guess is always the case of everything we do as historians. Like I'm always kind of interested in the fact that as a historian, I myself am like historically constituted and situated. So, you know, like I think the third book I wrote is a book when I'd become a dad. So I was at a different stage of my life. And I think it's interesting looking back on that book. That's the book where I talk a lot about family separation. Like, in a sense, I'm not saying all history is autobiography, but I actually think as historians, we write, you know, at times of our lives. Like if you think about our kind of stage, that was a book of my 20s. If you like, the book of my 30s was a book which was much more about a social history of the Holocaust in Hungary, which was focused on the family. And I think that was a book of a young dad, you know, and I wasn't a young dad in my 20s. I was a young dad in my 30s.
No, but I think this is also what this team year is about, is that what people think of places like Westerbork or other places has also a lot to do with who these people are and where they come from and what they experience in life and what they see. And this is also one of the points I think you make in your book. You say that maybe Steven Spielberg had a more influence on the way people look nowadays, and especially also at the end of the 90s at the Holocaust than historians. And that our image of the Holocaust is constructed a lot by films and by TV and by books, and it's way more about that depiction of the Holocaust than what happened itself. And you began with the sentence, "I was surprised at what I saw in Auschwitz," and this is also one of the things that daily occurs in Westerbork. People are surprised that Westerbork looks like how it looks like, and how can you explain that? What is the of course it's a very difficult question, but how do people look at the Holocaust? What is their perspective on the Holocaust? Is there a general thing you can say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, one, just maybe to take the example of Schindler's List. One thing I'm intrigued about there is if you think about that moment in the early 90s when Schindler's List comes out, I guess the other thing that's coming out more within the world of history is Chris Browning's Ordinary Men. So that's published more or less exactly the same time, isn't it? It's very much in the early 90s. I think it's 91, 92, that book. Maybe comes out in paperback just around the same time that Schindler's List emerges. And I guess for those of you who've seen Schindler's List, those of you who've read Chris Browning's book, they almost offer diametrically opposed ideas of the perpetrator, don't they? So who the Holocaust perpetrator is. So in Schindler's List, you have Amon Gut, who is almost like portrayed as a kind of psychotic murderer, you know, someone who derives pleasure from killing. And then Chris Browning's book, Ordinary Men, is quite the opposite in a sense, because it's saying actually the people who killed Jews in occupied Poland, Police Battalion 101, they're these guys from Hamburg. They're in their middle-aged men because they're too old to be in the military, and so they're put into these ordinary police battalions. They've actually grown up in a leftist context in Hamburg. Most of them aren't members of the Nazi Party. They're not like ideologues. They're not ideologically committed, and that they kill for these much more banal reasons. So they kill Jews. Chris Browning suggests largely because of things like peer pressure or you know, cowardice in a sense. They don't want to be seen as like weak by their fellow soldiers or by their fellow police battalion members, or they think of this as an opportunity for career advancement. You know, in some ways, I think the East is almost like the Wild West, isn't it? It's the Wild East. It's a place where people build careers. And so I guess what's interesting there is you have these two very different ideas of the perpetrator emerging in the early 90s. One is a historian who's saying the perpetrators are people like us, you know, and he ends the book, I think, with this really chilling account where he says something like, you know, all of us are conscious of things like peer pressure, and all of us think about career advancement. If the men of ordinary Police Battalion 101 could become killers, then, you know, in a sense, anyone could become a killer. This idea that the perpetrator lies much more towards the surface of European society or modern society, versus Schindler's List, where in a sense, I think we're encouraged to identify with Schindler, aren't we? Definitely not Amon Gut. Like Gut is the other. Gut is the crazy guy, and Schindler is someone more like us. He's mixed like we are. Like he's kind of wanting to do good, but he's also like not perfect. And so I was really interested in that sense that here you have these two very different stories. One is one where, in a sense, a filmmaker says, be a rescuer. Like that's who you are. Like we're all kind of basically rescuers, just waiting for our moment to be a rescuer. Whereas Chris Browning's saying, hang on, guys, just be a bit careful, because actually maybe we're more likely to be a perpetrator within the context of genocide. And I think for me, what I was interested there is, in some ways, is thinking about the Holocaust, or confronting the Holocaust. Is it something that comforts us, or is it something that challenges us? And I guess that's one thing I've always been interested in with Holocaust sites, somewhere like Westerbork or Auschwitz, or Holocaust museums, or Holocaust representations, or Holocaust history, is, does my encounter with the Holocaust at those places, does it challenge me? So does it cause me to be self-reflective? Like, do I think, oh yeah, I'd be one of the good guys, or do I actually have a more kind of profound challenge? And I think that's one thing, I've been always interested in, and I know this is something that you've been interested in, Bas, more recently at Westerbork and others like you, is how do we represent the perpetrator at Holocaust sites? So I guess one critique I had of the US HMM Museum as it's created at that time was that it felt that it very much positioned the visitor as either a liberating soldier, so a kind of good guy, an American liberating soldier, who maybe gets there too late, but would have stopped it if they could, or as a Jewish victim, as a kind of memory space. And it doesn't ever really, in a sense, position you as someone who might consider the fact, like, how do ordinary people like me or you become caught up in populist nationalist movements, or how do we end up voting for a populist nationalist leader, or how do we get caught up in racism or anti-Semitism, or how do we do something like perpetrate genocide? And so I think, to me, I guess I hope that always historians are asking difficult questions. And I suppose part of my critique in that book, which I think I would still sustain, is like, I sometimes wonder if we let ourselves off too easily when we encounter the Holocaust, that we too easily default to, like, oh yeah, I'd be a rescuer like Oscar Schindler, or I'd be a liberator like the US troops. And not that I don't feel like, I don't want to like say, go to Westerbork and feel terrible about yourself, but I think go to Westerbork and actually ask yourself some profoundly challenging questions about who was caught up with this, in what different roles, and why were people caught up. And I guess that's one thing I've always been interested in doing. I mean, I think that's a kind of classic history thing, isn't it? That I think as historians, I suppose we're always really interested in challenge and critique and nuance. And I suppose what I felt was, looking at some of the different representations of the Holocaust around in the 1990s, is it felt to me that they were a little bit simplistic, or they just let us off a little bit too easily.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that comes really out of your book, is that at USHMM, but especially also Schindler's List, they maybe also choose the simple road, and not say, okay, the Holocaust, the war, even history in total is way more complex than you can put in 3 hours of film or in an exhibition. And this is, of course, not a critique that was new for 1999. This was also the critique that Claude Lanzmann had on a series like the Holocaust in the 1970s already, yeah. A trivialization of the Holocaust, you could say. On the other hand, people would argue that people who saw Schindler's List, maybe for them, this was the first time really hearing about the Holocaust. And without a film like Schindler's List, or without things like that, or an exhibition, they would never have heard about that part of history. How do you look at that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a totally fair point. I mean, I think I wrote somewhere else in a kind of later piece of work about the fact that there's almost this Schindler's List generation that I'd very much see myself as part of. So I was, just finished being an undergraduate student when the film came out. So I was just starting to do the PhD. And so I'm part of that generation who was in their young 20s when that movie came out. And I think there's a whole generation of us who were of that age for whom this was a really significant movie. Like we watched, like for Holocaust, a generation before, of seeing this film and being kind of shocked by that. And I think there is, I've really thought a lot about this, about that sense of, okay, well, is there a sense in which I'm saying, like, the thing you need to read is Chris Browning's book in 1993, not watch Oscar Schindler? Maybe I think it's about about both, but I've really thought a lot about that recently, because one of the things I've done more recently is I was part of the advisory board for the new Imperial War Museum Holocaust exhibition. So in a sense, this is like almost, we have an expression in British English, poacher turned gamekeeper, which I don't know if it translates so much in Dutch. The idea of someone who is like stealing the animals from the land, suddenly becoming the kind of police person. And so in a sense, for me, it was like the critic becoming the person who was involved in creating a museum display. And that's not writing a history book, is it? Like, as you know, Bas, like a museum display has to be a totally different experience. Now, the thing that I think is interesting to reflect on is how can we engage in a kind of simplification of the complexity of the Holocaust without losing some of that complexity, and in particular, without defaulting to a kind of simple lesson that we want people to walk away with. So I think this for me was one of the critiques that I had within the 90s, was that I felt that a lot of representations of the Holocaust in the 1990s almost started with the message we want at the end, and then almost like retroactively work back from that. So maybe so here's the thing we want at the end, which is like, we don't be racist. Say that was our mantra. Like, we want to create like Holocaust equals don't be racist. So what we do is we decide what we'll create is an exhibition that a kid goes to, and then they walk out and they're no longer racist. And so obviously what you do is then you kind of retrofit, and you essentially tell a story which says the Holocaust was all about racist anti-Semitism. You know, the reason that people killed Jews was because of racist anti-Semitism, and therefore don't be a racist. And I guess for me, what I really was challenging was I was challenging that sense of defaulting too quickly to like the idea of Peter Novick talks about reducing history to a bumper sticker, or I guess I was interested in the idea of a lesson, like reducing the Holocaust to a lesson. That in some ways, I think the Holocaust wasn't just about racist anti-Semitism. It was about all sorts of things. Like, it was about the war. It was about a whole different set of ideologies. It was about economics. It was about something that emerged in a much more kind of roundabout way. And so one of the things that I guess I've always been interested in is, let's not worry too much about what we want the ideal visitor to walk away with, or the ideal viewer to walk away with. And in a sense, the thing I guess I was interested in here, and this I suppose is in essence the book that I wrote, was that I think all too often Holocaust memory begins with an ideology. So it begins with a kind of fundamental ideology, which might be an ideology you and I would agree with. Like, we might agree with the ideology of anti-racism. You know, like, I certainly agree with the ideology of anti-racism, but I don't think the ideology of anti-racism should be the starting point for creating a representation of the Holocaust, because I think the Holocaust is such a complex event that I think we need to try and tell some of that complexity. We have to simplify the complexity, but try and keep the complexity in there, with a sense that we trust the viewer or the visitor to walk away with their own learning and understanding, and that would be more multiple. Because in a sense, I think you could just sit a kid down and say, don't be racist. Like, that's fine, I think, to do that, isn't it? I don't feel like we should send them through a museum and hope that that's the one message they walk away with. Like, I think we need to trust people, in a sense, visitors, and to give them a kind of complex story, and to really trust that actually they'll walk away with a set of complex learning if we've given them, you know, the kind of complexity of the history. And so, you know, one thing I really hope with the new Imperial War Museum is that lots of visitors would walk away with different lessons learned, if you like. They'd have different sets of reflections, because different parts of the museum would impact them or touch them, that there'd be a little detail that they'd spot that would be the thing they take away. And I don't know if that's true for you, Bas, and for colleagues in Westerbork, whether that's a sense in which you don't necessarily want every visitor to walk away with the same single message or point, but actually what you want is that maybe visitors come back multiple times and receive different stories. And I think that's very much what we hope to do with the Imperial War Museum exhibition. And I think that's the thing that I guess I felt there was a lack of in the 90s, that I almost felt like maybe there was an oversimplification of the Holocaust and a tendency to start with an ideology. And in a sense, I felt that was deeply problematic, because I think a lot of the problem with the Holocaust was it started with an ideology, you know, especially a nationalist ideology. And it felt all too often for me that the kinds of maybe some of the museums that were emerging in that period were driven by a nationalist ideology, in different nations within Europe or the United States or Israel, or they were driven by a kind of different sort of ideology, whether that be the ideology of liberalism in the case of Anne Frank, or an ideology of kind of a set of American values, maybe in the sense of Oscar Schindler, like the good capitalist, a kind of ideology of kind of capitalism and philanthropy, and so in a sense, I think my critique has always been, and I guess I would sustain this, even the guy who's now in his 50s, young 50s, would still sustain that kind of critique of in a sense, all of us asking that question, and maybe inviting visitors to do that as well, is what's the underlying ideology of this Holocaust representation or Holocaust memory? And not that I think all of us are ideological, aren't we? We're all situated in particular times and places. But I'd really encourage a kind of self-reflectivity on the part of those of us who are creating museums, or creating representations of the Holocaust, and to almost teach our visitors critical set of skills so that they can really interrogate the representation that we offer. And I guess for me, I think increasingly people are feeling this, actually, Bess, that I think they're increasingly feeling like we've had 30 years of Holocaust representation and Holocaust memory, but it hasn't necessarily made the world a better place. Like, it hasn't necessarily meant that people don't vote for populist nationalist parties. It hasn't necessarily meant that racism and anti-Semitism are in decline. It hasn't necessarily meant that we have peace rather than war in Europe and beyond. And so I think there is a moment now where I think maybe we're more critical. We're more critical about almost a kind of period back in the 90s when I think we put almost too much pressure on the Holocaust to do a lot of work for us, to create a kind of more tolerant society. And I don't think you can do that on any bit of history. Like, I don't think we can ask history to do that for us. I think we need other things to do that. If we want to build a more tolerant society, I don't think we should take a kid to a Holocaust museum or show them a Holocaust movie. I think we need to have a different set of conversations. We can talk what those conversations might be later.
No, I totally agree. I think that a lot of times, and it's with an exhibition, but also with films, we want to give people an answer. But for me, if people go to Westerbork with questions and go away with even more questions, that's good.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
The history is so complex that, and then they go away with more questions and then research the questions themselves. It will be, for me, way more interesting than give an answer in like 90 minutes visit or 2 hours visit. You cannot do this. This is impossible to tell the whole story of a place like Westerbork, even only Westerbork, in 90 minutes. And I think this is also one of the things that you wrote in your book, getting back to the first part of your answer, is that films like Schindler's List or other kind of things, they really want to have a message of hope. It's almost, there's a happy ending to the film. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, in big contrast to what happened during the Holocaust, which is mainly, I would say, the murder on 6 million people and not the survivors. How can we I think this is a paradox which is quite difficult, because if you look at films, if you look at popular culture, it's always the thing that isn't general, that people are interested in. So how can we tell the stories of the Holocaust with stories who are not particular for the Holocaust? How can we really deflate this kind of paradox?
Yeah, and I think in a sense the paradox is kind of very much emerges from the nature of the experience, doesn't it? The thing about genocide is that most people don't survive and leave almost no archival trace. So there's just almost like nothing, isn't there, for so many of the victims of the Holocaust, is that they disappear from the record in, say, 1941 or 1942. I mean, it depends a little bit, doesn't it, on which camps they came through, and the record keeping, ITS archives in Bad Arolsen has records for many. But if you think about the face-to-face killings that take place in the East, kind of first phase of the Holocaust in occupied Soviet territory in 1941-42, I mean, we know next to nothing about that. We know hardly anything about the names of those, apart from if there's a family member who survives who then gives information about the names. And so I think one of the challenges is that, in a sense, the story of the majority is the story we don't have, and that the stories that we do tend to have are the stories of survival. it's by definition those who survive who tend to tell their stories. And so those are the stories that at least have some kind of degree of hopeful ending. If you think about the Shoah Foundation, the Visual History Archive, set up by Spielberg, isn't it? Set up by Spielberg. And one of the things they do at the end of the interview, end of each interview, is the survivor invites their family members to come and join them. And in a sense, there's a kind of happy ending of sorts, isn't there, at the end of the narrative, which is to show his survival and the family line. And I'm not saying that's not true, because of course that's true. People did survive, but those who survived are the exception rather than the rule. And I think that one of the challenges is that in a sense that we almost have to work against the grain, which is to work against the exceptional stories, or to spell out the exceptionality of the exceptional stories. So to be really clear about, this is an exceptional story, and so treat it that way, that the exceptional stories can't speak for the whole, or if they do, they have to speak in a kind of very sophisticated way. And one thing I'm interested in here is I'm really interested in the work of microhistorians. So there's a group of historians in Italy in the 1970s and 80s who create a school of microhistory, and it becomes quite influential. People probably know of the book by Natalie Zeman Davis, The Return of Martin Guerre, or certainly the musical, the film, this story about an exceptional character, or there's a story of a 16th century miller, and he's an exceptional character. And I think there is a real role for exceptional stories, that I think there's some really important microhistorical works. I myself, the third book I wrote was a microhistory. I think Chris Browning's book is a microhistory. There's a brilliant book by which is called A Past in Hiding, which is a book about one woman in hiding in Germany. And it's very much, I think, again, a microhistory. So I think there's some brilliant examples of microhistories that intentionally take an exceptional character to try and understand something going on. But what they're really careful to do is they're really careful to spell out the exceptionality. So they're really careful to say, this is the exceptional story. And I guess that's one of my critiques in some ways of some of the stories. Like, say, if you take a story like Schindler's List, in a sense, it doesn't necessarily carefully spell out the exceptionality of this story. And I think that the danger, I think, is that maybe by latching onto the exceptional stories of survival or of rescue, we, like you said, can have a happy ending. We can have a more hopeful encounter with genocide. Maybe this is genocide that's acceptable, which is the genocide where a few people survive or a few people are rescued. And I wonder if it's almost a kind of a resistance on our part, Bas, as just human beings, a resistance to kind of face the darker truth of human history, especially I think as Europeans, to face the darker history of Europe, in a relatively short period ago, in the lifetime of some of us, or the lifetime certainly of like my mum, was a child at the time, that I think sometimes maybe we don't want to face that darkness, and therefore we look for the exceptional stories. And I do fear that a little bit in some of the kind of newer projects around survivors. The kind of the projects that, and I work with survivor testimony, like the book kind of Before Last is a book that totally draws upon survivor testimony. But as I work with that, I really want to be careful that I don't use the exceptional narrative of the survivors of genocide to miss the story of the majority experience, which was murder, and death. And I think that is one of the real paradoxes and challenges that we have, is that we have the sources of the richest sources of those who survived in many ways. I mean, I guess in some ways, if you're working at somewhere like Westerbork or Auschwitz, if you think about the infrastructure of killing or deportation in the case of Westerbork, then we have some of that surviving architecture, don't we? We have, in a sense, the traces of the bigger story. But when we take individual narratives, I think often we default to stories of survival or rescue.
No, and I think that one of the, if you look at Westerbork, one of the images that people have from, okay, this is a prisoner from Westerbork, of course, is Anne Frank. She is, I think, the most famous prisoner of Westerbork, I would say, even the most famous individual story of the Holocaust. And nowadays you see her story everywhere, in the US and the UK and in the Netherlands, and all kind of forms. And you see it in films, of course, musicals already. You see it in theater play already in the 1950s, I believe you wrote in America, and also kind of merchandising. We have now a big exhibition about the memory of Camp Westerbork, which also shows kind of merchandising you can buy on Etsy in the US online. Where is the line between art and kitsch and within telling the Holocaust? Who draws that line? Is that memorial centers like Westerbork? Is that survivors? I think like 10 years ago, there was a famous early YouTube video called Dancing Auschwitz. Survivor, I think you will know it.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody looked at it and said, you cannot do it. And afterwards people learned this was really a survivor. And said, okay, if it's surviving, you can do it. Who draws the line in memorialization in telling the story of the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that I've thought a lot about, because one of my reflections on the book that, the book that we're discussing from 1999, is that I wonder if in that book I was attempting to be a kind of historian drawing the line. So one of my reflections was whether, in a sense, I was saying, it's the historians you should trust to draw the line. Like, the historians know where to draw the line. Like, they know the history. They're the people who should make these decisions. But I think I became increasingly dissatisfied with that idea. And there was a piece of work written by a scholar called Helene Flansbaum at the time when Life is Beautiful came out, the Benigni film Life is Beautiful, which many will have seen, which is a kind of comedy, in a sense, a kind of like comic love story set in a kind of a camp-ish, it's an Italian story, and it's a kind of it becomes a game. The child survives because the father creates this game. It's a sort of fantasy. It's a really interesting film. And one of the things that Flansbaum, there's a lot of criticism of this film because people see it crossing the line. In a sense, in some ways I was critical of it because it's a happy ending story in some ways. Like, it's mixed, isn't it? Like, the father dies, but the son survives. The Holocaust becomes a game. He creates a game, and through that, the son survives. So it's this kind of mythical fantasy story. But one of the things that Flansbaum writes about is she's really critical of so-called gatekeepers of the Holocaust. So she's really critical of those gatekeepers of Holocaust memory. And I think I have a lot of sympathy for that sense of, actually, who is any of us to say this is right, this is wrong when it comes to Holocaust memory? Like, in some ways, I think there's some basic things, aren't there, which is like, actually, let's just do a bit of fact checking. So, like, is there a kind of simple fact checking that we can do? But in terms of the kitsch, like who am I to say this is kitsch? Like, especially within a kind of artistic representation, like I think I've become increasingly kind of worried about that sort of line drawing. And I was thinking, I don't know if you remember the social media, I think it's called Holocaust, where there was an artist who took a set of photographs of people at the Berlin Memorial and superimposed them on corpses. So someone maybe is like sitting on one of the steel pillars in Berlin, and then and they post a selfie, or they post something from there, and then they then appear sitting on top of a pile of corpses as a kind of critique. And I felt like unease about that, because I felt like, actually, someone is just, maybe they're tired, you don't know what's happening in their life, and maybe it's okay to sit on a steel pillar in the middle of Berlin. Maybe doing that is a point where you are reflecting, like, what's going on inside someone's head at that point. And so I think I've become less critical. And I wonder, we talked at the beginning, Bas, didn't we, about that was a book written by a guy in his 20s. Like, maybe the older guy, the slightly older guy, is someone who's maybe more critical of that. And I think in some ways I maybe now welcome a whole set of responses to the Holocaust. I think there's still a real important, just for kind of fact checking stuff, to be aware of, which is more that sense of, like, is this an exceptional story? Like, if it's an exceptional story, let's be honest about this. What are the truth claims? So I guess I'm interested now in what are the truth claims we make for our representation of the Holocaust. Like, if we're making a truth claim, then let's be careful about that. And I think, one thing that's interesting, if you think of Schindler's List then is shown in American classrooms with a kind of teaching pack around it. And in a sense, I think it was therefore making a kind of truth claim. Once it goes into an educational setting, it was saying, this isn't just a film, this is an educational resource. It was kind of repurposed as an educational resource. And so I think when something is making that kind of truth claim, then I think fair game. Let's critique, because I think any time we're making a truth claim, then I think we're inviting people to critique and to question that. But in terms of artistic responses or individual responses, I think I've become much more kind of conscious of maybe none of us should play that gatekeeper role, or we should be careful about playing that gatekeeper role. We should be a little bit cautious about that. I think, there was a famous episode, wasn't there, where a young woman took a selfie at Auschwitz and posted that on social media, and immediately there's a kind of storm. And in some ways, I was worried about that response, that kind of like quickly judging someone, because we don't know the full story of why that person went to Auschwitz, of what they experienced or what they took away from them. And one of the things actually I did a short piece that I wrote about, was I was really interested in, I wrote a piece about survivors taking selfies at Auschwitz. I was really interested in survivors who also took portraits at Auschwitz. And I think this gets back to an issue. Is it okay for a survivor to take a staged portrait at Auschwitz? Is it okay for a young American woman to take a staged portrait at Auschwitz? I think probably it is. I think both of them are doing it for a set of reasons that maybe we need to try and understand. And so I've kind of pulled back, I think, Bas, in some ways. I say, if you're making truth claims, let's critique. But actually, I think artistic representation, I've become much more open. And I think probably have seen really the value of a lot of artistic representation, that actually art might be a really important way of experiencing and relating to the Holocaust. Art that isn't claiming truth for itself, but is offering a different kind of truth, if you like, not a kind of forensic truth, but a more kind of experiential or kind of reflective kind of truth, calling us to engage with the Holocaust in a different way.
Yeah, and I would say it also has, I think this is also what you are saying, has a lot to do with the intention of somebody who makes a photo. And I always think of that feeling uncomfortable can be good in the sense that 20 years ago, I believe, there was an artist in America, a big exhibition, who made the Lego Auschwitz, which really started a big dialogue. And okay, if this is your purpose, to create something that makes people uncomfortable and it gets you into a dialogue, and again, questions coming out when you go to memorials, and you go away with questions, and feeling uncomfortable can also be a good thing if you have the right intention, I would say.
And it was a really interesting project. It's a Polish artist, isn't it? It was exhibited in Mirroring Evil, which was in the Jewish Museum in New York. And I think a lot of the pieces in there are really interesting. I mean, partly for the reason we talked about, which is that they confront the idea of the perpetrator. So I think all of the pieces chosen for that exhibition were artists who were confronting the idea of the perpetrator. And one thing, I use the Lego, that Lego example in the way, I've written about it a couple of times, but I used it to introduce a second book I wrote about, which was about ghettoization in Budapest, because I was really interested in that idea of the provocation, in a sense, of a Lego set which you could build anything from, but that anything included a concentration camp. Because I think, again, like coming back to what I started with Chris Browning, I think that does push back to us the sense that, in a sense, when we create the world and we go about our day-to-day life in the world, we can make anything in some ways, can't we? And some of the things we make are evil. Sometimes we build concentration camps, and sometimes we build other things. And that the Lego set is multi-purpose, isn't it? I mean, that's the joy of a Lego set in some ways, is that kids can use their creativity to build absolutely everything. And in a sense, I use that really as a way to spin out, to think a bit about, for example, the way that Bauhaus-trained architects were also involved in creating camps like Auschwitz. And that, the Holocaust didn't emerge from nowhere, but it emerged out of architectural training, the infrastructure of the Holocaust, and it emerged out of intellectual European society, the same society that you and I are part of. That we went to European universities, and many of those who perpetrated the Holocaust also went to European universities, that they were educated, smart, thoughtful people. They were moderns like us. And I think that's one thing that I really love about that project, is the Lego project, I think, really invites you to do that. And I wonder sometimes whether artists, I think, can be really used. They can play a really important part. Like, in a sense, I'm saying historians shouldn't just be the only people talking about the Holocaust. I actually think artists are kind of brilliant people to talk about the Holocaust, because I think artists can provoke us to reflect in different ways. And, I think one thing that I've been really pleased to see at Westerbork is the way that you've worked with contemporary artists in some ways to work with historians, but also to work with contemporary artists, to invite visitors to see this not just as a place where they learn some historical facts, but an artist maybe also provokes them to think in a different way. And I think, that's to me is something that I'd really love us to kind of think about more in future representations, is how can we bring a range of disciplines together to explore the complexity of this event.
Yeah, and I think this is also even a paradox that a 40-year-old Dutch white male talks with a 50-year-old English white male about memorization. But you've talked about that you worked in the Holocaust Museum in London, and the difficulty for me is also in getting back to providing the line, ethical line. Where can you go? I'm not 20. I'm not black. So how can I say to somebody who has completely different kind of cultural background than me, this is the line, this is how you should learn about the Holocaust, this is how you should memorialize, this is impossible to do. And I think for us in Westerbork, but also I think in other memorials, through working with artists, but also through working with young people with different kind of backgrounds and really listening and learning, this is a way for you to learn about the Holocaust. It's not my way, but I'm not you. I think this is very important, that not only we as historians live in an ivory tower and say this is the way you should do it.
Yeah, there's one thing I did with the Imperial Museum. So I was on the advisory board for the exhibition, but then one thing I did was I was also on an advisory board for the educational offering. So there was an app developed. It's a really interesting way of navigating around the museum. One of the things that I loved that they did there was what they invite. So every group of young people that go around the museum exhibit, they invite them to write something and to put it in an envelope, which is what they've learnt, and then to give that as a gift to the next group. So if you like, the next group of teenagers, like 14, 15-year-old English kids who end up there in London, they get an envelope from a group of kids that went before them, which says, this is what I learned. And then in a sense, that group of kids, after they've written their own, and then they gift on to someone else. And I really like that sense that the educators were really happy to feel like actually they trusted the kids to reflect for themselves and to offer their own lessons learned. So rather than it being like, this is the single lesson, that actually it's a much more dynamic experience where the kids themselves are responding to what we created and the education team have created and the museum curators have created in the exhibition and with the app, to then offer their own kind of lessons. And I think there's something really powerful about that, which I'm really interested in about, is like, how can we do that? How can visitors, in a sense, be also curators or interpreters? How can a former visitor, I love that idea that you get a gift from a former visitor to a site who gives you a little bit of their own personal reflection. In a sense, then there's almost like a little, or almost a hidden secret dialogue, isn't there, that takes place between two little groups of 15, 16-year-old British kids, who just like are having this conversation. They're not saying this is the only thing you can learn from this museum or the only thing you can learn about the Holocaust, but they're thinking, oh, that's interesting. That's what they took away. I took this away. Let's have this kind of dialogue or conversation. And I think that's nice, that sense of like, as historians, as educators, as curators, like, can we trust people? I think, like, let's trust people. Let's try and give people an experience and that's based in the history and has artistic kind of interpretation, but let's trust them to respond to that and to, be engaged in kind of dialogue with each other.
Yeah, and I think that's also interesting in international projects, for example, because my experience is, and I want to hear what your experience is, that learning about the Holocaust in for example, the US or the UK is different than in countries like the Netherlands, where it really happened, you can say, and even completely different. I visited Auschwitz a couple of years ago, and I saw a lot of Israeli young people over there, and in my mind it was completely different than how I learned about the Holocaust and how I was taught about the Holocaust. How do you view that?
Yeah, and I think that was, in a sense, what the kind of very beginning of that book was, going to Poland and sort of, in a sense, seeing what a Polish teenager would be learning through the exhibition, in a sense, became the sort of driving question. I think that's still the question I have, which is that in some ways, all of us within our different national traditions, we teach this event very differently, don't we, depending on our relationship to it. And maybe as individuals, we teach it very differently according to our relationship with it. And in some ways, I think that's to be expected. like I think that's kind of that there isn't a single narrative, that there's multiple narratives. I think that the one thing I would say is I think there's still a place for a kind of critiquing, and maybe an inviting to a kid into a critiquing, or a visitor into a critiquing. So I'm quite interested, like without getting too meta, I'm quite interested in that sense of how do we invite the visitor into almost a kind of dual positionality when they visit a site, which is that partly they're visiting a site to learn about the events that took place there, but they're also aware that the way those events have been interpreted and memorialized has changed over time and space. So that over the 70 years of the post-war era, that any site like Westerbork or Auschwitz, the way that the site has been interpreted and memorialized has changed. And how do we lay bare that sense that at different times in history, we focused on different parts of this story, or we've told this story slightly differently? And also, I think then to also give visitors a sense of maybe spatial kind of understanding, which is that actually in different places around the world, this story is also told differently. I've always been interested in like, so someone who maybe goes to Westerbork, is there a way in which they could also reflect on the fact that at a different camp in Germany, maybe the story is told slightly differently, or in Drancy, or in Fossili, or at Washington, D.C., in a sense, the same event is being narrated, but it's being told in a slightly different way. And in some ways, I think I'm really interested in how do we give people, visitors, how do we give students, how do we give school kids the tools to be those kind of almost like critical memory agents, so that the individuals are aware the fact that history is always retold for every generation in different places. And we need to ask those questions, almost as critical questions about, well, who's telling me this story, and why are they telling me this story? Like, which bits of the story aren't they telling me, and which bits of the story are they telling me, and what's their ultimate goal in telling this story? And to be those kinds of critical visitors. And I think, one thing I guess I'm really interested in is how can you equip museum visitors to be kind of critical museum visitors? So to be in some ways asking those kinds of questions about curatorship, about like, why have they put that caption in this way? Like, why have they chosen this object? Why are they drawing attention to this? So I'm really interested in that sense of how, we can be sort of in encouraging that kind of self-reflection. And in a sense, I think that was kind of why I wrote the book. In some ways, the book was really written to do that. It was to almost say, hey, look, here's the story told 6 really different ways. Like, why is it being told 6 different ways? And in some ways, that was just a snapshot of the fact that the story is told loads of different ways. And in some ways, I always want to really invite a kind of critical reader, a critical viewer, a critical visitor. Like, I want my own students to do that in the classroom, like to be critical of the lectures I give them, or like now, I want you to be critical of what I'm saying and not saying. But I really want to think about how can I equip students to be really critical readers? How can I equip museum visitors to be really critical museum visitors? How can I equip a bunch of 14-year-olds, whether they're in the UK or Netherlands or Israel or America, going to a Holocaust site or a museum? How can I equip them to be really critical in thinking a bit about what's being told and why, and how do they respond to that?
Yeah, and critical, I would say, in the sense that that people learn that other people have different points of view, and not just criticize the point of view, but learn why people have other points of view, and why the Holocaust is seen completely different, I would say, in some parts of Israel than in the Netherlands, than in the US. And I think that's very interesting. And I think that in making an exhibition, like you were an advisory board, should an exhibition in a place like Westerbork be about history, of course, but also it should also be maybe about the memory of history. And because if you look at places like Westerbork, often they have way more to do how they look like now with the last 78 years than the 5 years before. And it's very striking to people, and people coming to Westerbork say, oh, the different kind of styles of monuments, and it's totally empty. You cannot explain this emptiness with explanation of the war. You have to talk about the last 78 years.
Which, and I think, to me, I actually think that's profoundly interesting. That sense of, that the story we've told about this event, or even a place like a single camp like Westerbork, or what we do with that camp, has changed so much. Like, it says a lot, I think, doesn't it, about 1950s Netherlands, or 1950s Europe, or 1970s, or 1990s. Like, in a sense, I think it's to me, that's as interesting as what happened in Westerbork in the 1940s is what happened to Westerbork in the 1950s, and how the Dutch government or nation did or did not deal with the wartime experience, and questions of collaboration, and all the kind of difficult questions, or questions of resistance, like all of the difficult questions that emerged during the war, are in a sense constantly being renavigated, aren't they, and renegotiated in the memorial sites that we go to. And I think, to me, that is something that I, in a sense, would love for all memorial sites, is that a memorial site would see itself having that dual function of inviting people to think about what happened here during the 1940s, but also to think about what happened here from the 1950s onwards, or even from 45 onwards. Like, how have we tried to make sense of this past? Because I think maybe that can help us to reflect a little bit about how am I trying to make sense of this past. And in some ways, I guess I'm interested in history for lots of reasons, but one of the things I'm interested in history is that I think history always points to partiality of knowledge, like that we don't know everything, that hopefully history introduces a degree of humility for us as individuals and as societies. And I think that, to me, is really important, is that we might go to Westerbork and be like, what? This is what they did in the 1950s? Like, they thought about it this way, or they got rid of these buildings, or they did this, or they didn't do that. But I hope what it would lead to is thinking, well, what are we doing in the 2020s? Like, we haven't reached some kind of level of perfection. Like, our own telling is as partial, or we're also making a set of mistakes, or we're also tending to do this or think about it this way because of the society and the context we live in. And I think that's, to me, is always the joy of history, is that history, it's like time travel, isn't it? History always takes us to a different place. Not just so we can look at the past and think, oh, they were weird, or they were like stupid, or they were violent, or they were mean, or they were nasty, or they were unenlightened. But maybe by visiting the past, I think hopefully we come to the present and we say, like, where's our unenlightenment now? Where are our blind spots? Where are the things we don't know about? What are the mistakes we're making in society? Like, I really want people to always be engaged in that kind of conversation between past and present, and to think about how we as historians, or as museum curators, or as educators, like, how can we encourage that kind of past-present dialogue? And I guess one of my criticisms, I think, in the book, in the the kind of the book we're talking about, which is now 25 years old almost, I think one of my criticisms, which I'd really stand with, is that I think too easily we think the past is like something that we can almost look at and just say, like, oh, they were bad people who did bad things. I think the Holocaust can sometimes be that, like, we would never do those kinds of things, or we're kind of more sophisticated. And I really don't want that to be the case. Like, I always hope in encountering the Holocaust and the ways in which we've remembered the Holocaust and the ways in which we've reflected on it would always be something that issues and results in a little bit of humility in the present, and a little bit of kind of questioning about the limits of knowledge in the present, or the limits of our own kind of ethical stance in the present.
I have two questions for you, because our hour is almost gone. It flew by, I would say. And just I wanted to say to the visitors, if you have your own questions, put them in the chat, and I can ask Tim. And reflecting on what you just said, Tim, I would say that this is also the study of history. And a lot of times my friends say to me, oh, you have researched everything on Westerbork, now you're done. And I say, yes, but the same old sources they researched in the 70s, I now look at it with my 2020 eyes. And in 20 years time, people would look at it with different kind of eyes. And this is the reason why it never stops. And in that context, looking back at your book 25 years ago, you said 25 years next year, is there Selling the Holocaust Part 2 coming up? Would you write it? And what would you write with your new eyes from 2020, I would say?
Yeah, I've thought about that a little bit, about whether I'd ever kind of rewrite it or kind of re-ask those questions. I think one thing that you you reference there, Bas, and I think is interesting is that, in a sense, history is always a balance or a dance between sources and questions. Like, we can go to the same sources with a new set of questions, and we, in a sense, tell a different story, don't we? And that's certainly one thing that you see within the most recent historiography of the Holocaust, is that I feel like there's all this new stuff coming out, which is often not new sources, but is just people asking questions we never thought to ask before, you know, these kind of new brilliant questions. And so one thing I think about that book is that I do think that I was asking a particular set of questions that were quite 1990s questions, which were, in a sense, here's the year of the Holocaust was 1993. We've had this moment of a kind of upturn in Holocaust representation and Holocaust memory. And my question was like, well, has it done any good? Like, what's the kind of the positives or negatives? And so what I guess I need to almost do is think like, well, what would be the 2023 or the next year, let's say it's the 25th anniversary, 2024 question, like what would be the 2024 question to ask of Holocaust representation, Holocaust memory culture, Holocaust museums? And I think there might be a sense in which the questions are worth asking again, that there actually may be some value, I think, in still asking these questions, which is to ask, actually, we've been doing Holocaust memory and representation education now for another 25 years. Like, where have we got with this? So I think that, to me, is a persistently good question to ask of any set of representations. I think what I would do is choose different representations, so to broaden the scope, because there's a lot of new representations. There's so many more new and interesting places to ask. I think to think about genocides, not just the Holocaust as one event, but to think more broadly about genocide would be really interesting, to think about those kinds of questions of genocide. The project I'm actually looking at is a project with a colleague called Tanja Schultz, who's an art historian in Stockholm. And we're actually looking at a project around what's the place of monuments and memorials in the 21st century, and do they have a place within contemporary democracies? And so in some ways, I feel like actually the new project that I'm working with Tanja is almost like a revisiting of this project, but in a slightly different way, which is to ask, after decades of monument building and memorial building, like, is there still a place? Like, what kind of role do they play? And in particular, what kinds of memorials are demanded in 21st century democracies? Like, what do we want memorials and monuments to do? And so in some ways, I feel like maybe I'm coming back to the question, but in a slightly different way, which is almost less as critique and more almost as a kind of looking forwards. So less a looking back and more a looking forward of like, what will be memorialization and monuments in the 21st century? And can we see anything in particular in the work of contemporary artists that points to productive ways of rethinking and reimagining memorialization?
Yeah, well, I think that's also one of the striking things, if you compare it to 1999, that looking at numbers of visitors and numbers of films coming out, it's not going down, it's going up.
Yeah.
So you say, okay, watching at memorials and monuments, are they needed? Yeah, probably, because people are going to those monuments. The question is, of course, what kind of meaning for visitors does Westerbork or a monument in London or everywhere have? But memorialization, I would say, and sometimes people argue that this is also one of the things coming out of the 90s, of that Europeanization, boundaries are going away, that people look at their own local history to find a kind of belonging to a group, belonging to a kind of group of people. And academics argue also this is one of the reasons that Stolperstein are here, and local monuments and micro history, and that we are now really more diving into that part of history, instead of only looking at Hitler, only looking at the bigger names, you would say. And my last question is probably the most difficult question, and a very wrong question, I know, for a historian, but can you predict a little bit of the future of memorialization? How does a place like Westerbork, how does telling the story of Westerbork look like in 2050, for example? What would be Selling the Holocaust Part 3? What would it be about, you could say?
Gosh, yeah, 2050. So I'll be just getting into my 70s then, Bas. So maybe that can be my last book, is if I'm still around, Selling the Holocaust Part 3. like historians are noticeably reticent of predicting the future because we feel like we're safe on the past and we're less good on the future. Although it's interesting, one of the things I've just been teaching this year in Bristol is I've been teaching a unit called Creative Futures. So I am actually really interested in futurology. I'm really interested in the way we think about the future. And one of the things we do with the students in that unit is we get them to imagine all sorts of futures. And then we invite them to think about actually how their imagination of the future might inform the present. And in a sense, invite them to think about actually as students, how do you build the kind of future you want? And so that's in some ways my kind of offering back to you would be that actually I do think this would be a really profoundly important thing for us to do more of, is to ask that question, is like, what is Westerbork 2050? Like, what do we want Westerbork 2050 to be? Because in a sense, we build that, don't we? Like Westerbork 2050 won't just happen to us. It'll happen year on year as you and your colleagues and all of us are engaged in this ongoing process of Holocaust history, of Holocaust memory, Holocaust education. And so I actually think we probably should do a bit more of that. Like as a historian, I've become quite interested in futures thinking as a way to reframe the present. So in some ways I'd be thinking like, well, what do we want? What do we want a visitor in 2050 to experience? Like, how do we want them to experience? And one thing that I'd be interested in, for example, is how could we think about Westerbork 2050 as a way for someone to go to one site, Westerbork, but to see that site as connected within a network? Like, could we use a set of technologies that we'll have in 2050 that would enable someone to be in Westerbork, but actually also simultaneously to experience the end of the deportation trains in Auschwitz, or to experience maybe the Stolpersteine, where someone was traveled from in their house in their apartment in Amsterdam, and the whole network. So could we, in a sense, connect someone to the entire story of the Holocaust? Could we use augmented reality or VR to enable someone to experience that? Could someone take a story from a neighborhood they come from? So could a bunch of Dutch kids that come from a particular neighborhood in Amsterdam, could they follow the story of someone who's a neighbor, who was a former neighbor of them? And could they follow them all the way through, say, even to the evacuations or the death marches that that person might have taken as they went from Auschwitz? Maybe they ended up in somewhere like Bergen-Belsen or Ravensbrück. So could we think about individual sites being part of this kind of connected whole, and really to think about how do we encourage a visitor to come to one place, but to think about the sense that the Holocaust was a networked event, and that people's experience was one of trajectories and of movement, and movement in an intercontinental sense. And so maybe that's my vision for a 2050, would be a visitor would use a whole set of technologies to both experience the Holocaust as a local event, but also as a continental wide or global event, and that actually they could travel. They could travel both in the kind of materiality of Westerbork, but also in a set of virtual realities and virtual travel to experience the complexity of the Holocaust as a kind of multi-site and multi-located event. So maybe that's what I'd want for a visitor. And I guess I'm always interested in futures as a way of thinking like, well, how could we start building that now? So like, what would we need? Or like, how could we start to tell those complex or connected stories? And how could a visitor at Westerbork have a live conversation with a visitor at Bergen-Belsen who happened to be there at the same time, or a visitor in Auschwitz or a visitor somewhere else? And how could they have this kind of dialogue and talk a bit about what they're experiencing? So how can we kind of think of visitors in more sort of network ways and the Holocaust in more network ways? Maybe we could start building that best for 2050.
It would be, I would gladly be on your side, I would say. And I think there are a lot of projects now that have these kind of focuses in Europe, and memorials like Westerbork and other memorials working together and finding the right answers, because for historians, a lot of times it's safe to only look at the past, but if you make decisions at memorial sites and create buildings and exhibitions for the next couple of years, you have to take a look at the future. You have to decide, which is completely difficult, how in 5, maybe 10 years time people would look at the Holocaust. One of the questions one of the viewers has a little bit to do with that. Looking at 2030 or 2040 and looking at the here and now, and we touched a little bit upon it. Do you see a difference in how the route is going in, for example, the United States in telling the story of Holocaust in comparison to Germany and the Netherlands? Are these roads getting more apart or getting on the same kind of road, using these kind of terms?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there's like quite clearly a divergence, and I think USHMM is a really clear example of that, isn't it? Where at USMHMM there was a kind of very much a telling of the story as something that happened over there. So the Holocaust was in a sense a safe story to tell because it was a German story or it was a European story. And so, you know, I write about this in the book about how, in a sense, the Holocaust was positioned as almost the kind of antithesis of Europe, of America. So America was about a place of democracy and freedom. Nazi Germany was a place of totalitarianism and oppression. And so one thing that you see, I think, within USHMM is like a very different telling of the narrative than maybe the Holocaust, say in somewhere like Westerbork or in Bergen-Belsen, where it's much closer to home, where the story was told in a way where it wasn't something that happened over there, but it was something that happened here. And so in a sense, questions of collaboration and complicity, or, you know, in certainly in somewhere like Germany, of perpetratorhood were absolutely central to the narratives. And I think the key question is, like, will this distinction stay? So will there be a sense in which, say in Germany, the Holocaust is told very much with a foregrounding of the perpetrator, and in America, the Holocaust is told with a foregrounding of the victim and the bystander and the liberator? Like, will that stay? I wonder if that divide might narrow. Like, one thing that I think is interesting, as I've chatted to people, I think Trump was an important moment in the United States. You know, I think that came as a shock in many ways to many people in the United States. You know, like if you've created the Holocaust Memorial Museum and you've had like 30 years of the Holocaust, like how can so many people vote for a populist nationalist leader? Is a really profound question, I think. And so one thing I do wonder is, I wonder if in the context of populist nationalism, which I think you've seen both in the United States and the UK, so I think Brexit as well was a kind of populist nationalist moment in the UK, wasn't it? Equivalent to the Trump moment in the United States. I wonder if there is a sense in which, in some ways, not the Holocaust has become a little closer, or if you think about Black Lives Matters, and the kind of impact of that in the United States, again, there's a sense in which the Holocaust in some ways comes a little bit closer. The idea of the perpetrator comes a little bit closer. And so I wonder if the kind of embracing or the facing up to the perpetrator that I think you definitely see happening and absolutely needs to happen in Germany, in post-war Germany, or, you know, in the case of Westerbork, the questions of complicity and collaboration, the kind of complex role played by people within Dutch society and the Dutch state, and Dutch organizations. I wonder if actually those questions will be asked a little bit more within the United States and within the UK. My hope is that they will be. I think it's, in some ways, it's too easy for the UK and the US to say the Holocaust happened over there and we didn't have anything to do with it. I think actually, in some ways, I think there's a need to think much more about the ways in which maybe the Holocaust needs to be represented and positioned within bigger stories of genocide or of colonialism and colonial violence, or of racism. And in a sense, that's where it becomes much closer to home, doesn't it, within the UK and the US? So I guess my hope is they'll come closer together. My fear is maybe they'll stay separate.
And one of the other questions from a viewer has to do with your answer on 2050, using VR, etc., these kind of things. If you look at, if you go back to the book and look at films like Schindler's List, one of the big criticisms was that it depicted a history that should not be depicted. It's also one of the reasons I would say that as an answer to Holocaust, Landsman created Shoah. And if you look at what Schindler's List was, it was 3 hours. Nowadays, social media, TikTokers have 30 seconds to tell the story of the Holocaust. And in VR, I would say, and holograms go way beyond immersiveness what Spielberg did. How do you look at this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question about, in particular, visual representation in new media. And that's something that, you know, lots of scholars are starting to work on. There's a really rich vein of research. I think one thing I'd be interested in, you know, if we take the example of like a networked kind of experience in 2050, one thing that I'd be interested in distinguishing there is the difference between trying to take a visitor back to, say, Auschwitz circa 1942-43 and taking a visit at Auschwitz circa 2050. Like, to me, there's a real difference there. And I think one thing I'd be interested in with that kind of idea of networking is how could we use VR, in a sense, to network Holocaust sites within their contemporary space? So that, say, I know, for example, at Westerbork, you've got the commandant's house that you've done quite a lot of work on. Like, in a sense, how could a visitor see virtually the present state of commandant's houses across a number of different Holocaust sites and think a bit about how they're interpreted, or like who was the commandant at the time, but more about the kind of contemporary context and like how another visitor is experiencing the commandant's house, say in Auschwitz, or somewhere like Bergen-Neuengamme, or, you know, somewhere where there's a commandant's house still standing. So I think that, to me, would be the interesting thing, is how could we use VR to kind of, in a sense, connect visitors in 2050 with sites in 2050. I'd be much more loath to think about recreating an experience of a train car or a gas chamber. Like, I think I'd have a lot of questions about that, about ethical questions, and just, I mean, the kind of moral questions about that. And so I think that you know, I did say I don't want to be a gatekeeper, but maybe I'd be happy to be someone who would critique that, who would say, actually, you know, like, as we develop VR, like, what are we wanting to represent? Like, where do we go and where don't we go? I think we need to ask those questions. And there's certainly places I would not want to go. But I actually think a kind of contemporary networking, or a networking with a historic map, I think those kinds of networkings I'd be really happy to do, but not to think about VR as kind of recreating a kind of virtual Holocaust, a kind of attempt to move people into the Holocaust in the past. I don't think we need to do that at all. But I think actually there could be a way in which a visitor to Westerbork could virtually experience the present site of Auschwitz in 2050 as they're in Westerbork, and think a little bit both about the site where many of the Jews of Westerbork were deported to, but also to think a bit about the different memory cultures with Westerbork 2050 and Auschwitz 2050, and maybe to engage with a visitor in Auschwitz 2050 live, to have a kind of dialogue or conversation.
I think this is the most difficult part of working in a memorial site, to really think about the boundaries, ethical boundaries that are there, that are completely shifting every couple of years, I would say, and are different with different kind of people. And especially in creating things like VR, this is really out there, and it's all about details, and all about, okay, you can do this and this not. And I remember a couple of years ago, they made a VR experience out of the Stasi prison in Berlin. They tested it with some former Stasi prisoners, and one of them said, I really loved it. I didn't sleep for 3 weeks. I had nightmares, but I really loved it. Is this the lesson you want people to take home with? You can, and I think being a gatekeeper is also asking questions, not always giving your opinion, but asking questions. Okay, is this really what you want? And asking questions is a little bit better, I would say, than raising the finger. You cannot do this, or you cannot do that. I would say. Tim, thank you so much for your insights. I think we've learned a lot from that, and we are looking forward to next year, Selling the Holocaust Part 2. We're really counting on it, that it's getting there, that it's coming out, and in 2050 you promised us the Selling the Holocaust Part 3. Visitors, thank you for being here. Also, next month, of course, there will be a new lecture. Then the role of personal story in talking about the past is central. And guest is then Suzanne Hogevorst, a well-known expert in this field in the Netherlands. Thank you again for being here tonight, and maybe see you next month. Have a nice evening.
Thank you so much. Bye now.